It started with a man who vanished without a trace. Ethan Cole, a 24-year-old photographer, walked into the Cascade Mountains one foggy September morning and never came back. For a year, the forest kept its silence until 3 cavers stumbled upon him deep inside Black Hollow Cave, chained to the rock, barely alive. And with no memory of what had happened, Ethan Cole had always felt more at home beneath the open sky than under a roof. He was the kind of man who chased the hush of wilderness, the unfiltered wind, the sound of rivers cutting through stone. Photography was his excuse to keep moving, to stay in motion, to justify his distance from the world that buzzed too loudly. At 24, he had a quiet reputation in Bend, Oregon, a solitary figure with a camera and a restless heart. Friends said he carried 2 things wherever he went: his old Nikon and a sense that he was looking for something he couldn't name. When he told his roommate he was heading out to Mirror Peak Trail for a weekend shoot, it sounded like any other trip. He'd said it the same way he always did, casual, offhand, "I'll be back tomorrow." But that was the last anyone ever heard from him. The morning he left, the air was heavy with the smell of rain. The Cascades loomed in the distance, dark ridges dissolving into cloud. Ethan packed light: a tent, a tripod, a first aid kit, and 2 rolls of film sealed in plastic. He left his phone charging on the counter, a habit that drove his roommate crazy, but this time he slipped it into his jacket pocket. He knew the service would vanish once he hit the trail, but he liked the idea of being unreachable. A gas station camera later caught him at dawn, filling a thermos with coffee, staring up at the gray horizon as if gauging how long the sky would hold. The clerk remembered him, polite, distracted, tapping the counter to some rhythm in his head. He paid cash, checked his map one last time, and drove off toward the mountains, leaving behind the flat hum of the town for the rough silence of stone and snow. By 8:45, his Jeep had climbed the last stretch of gravel leading toward Mirror Peak. The logging roads twisted like veins through the forest, narrowing until they were more suggestion than path. A ranger stationed near Three Sisters Wilderness later recalled seeing a silver Jeep that morning, the driver alone, the back seat stacked with gear. It wasn't unusual, not there, not then. The trail was a magnet for hikers, photographers, and weekend wanderers. But what struck the ranger later was how quickly the weather turned after the car disappeared from sight. Within an hour, clouds thickened, the air dropped 10 degrees, and rain fell in sheets that blurred the ridges into ghosts. The next day, Ethan's roommate tried to call him, then again and again. No answer. It wasn't unusual for Ethan to go off the grid for a night, but by the second evening, worry began to gnaw. He reached out to the local sheriff's office in Deschutes County, who logged it as a routine welfare check, another hiker overdue in unpredictable terrain. By the following morning, search teams were mobilized. They found his Jeep parked neatly in the designated lot near Mirror Peak, doors locked, keys missing. Inside were 2 bottles of water, a raincoat, a folded map, and his spare socks, things he never forgot to carry. What was missing were his backpack and camera. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints except those washed away by rain. Search dogs caught a scent from the driver's seat and followed it along the trailhead. For nearly half a mile, the dogs pulled steady, noses low, bodies tense. Then just past a slope of shale, the scent vanished as if erased. The handler noted in his report that the trail ended near a narrow drop locals called the Hollow Well, a natural fissure surrounded by loose rock and dense firs. Old-timers said the mountain sometimes took people there, meaning they'd fall, get disoriented, or disappear into hidden mine shafts. The search teams combed the area for days. Helicopters swept overhead, their rotors scattering pine needles like rain. Nothing. No tent, no trace, nobody. The mountain had swallowed him whole. As the days turned into weeks, the case of Ethan Cole became another ghost story of the Cascades. Posters faded on bulletin boards. Tourists still hiked the same trail, stepping unknowingly over the ground where dozens had searched. His family visited twice, then stopped coming. There was nothing to find. The official report described him as an experienced outdoorsman, well prepared, and likely the victim of an accidental fall during a storm. But there was no evidence, not a torn strap, not a broken lens, nothing to say he had ever walked past the trailhead. Yet not everyone believed he was gone. Sheriff Dana Holt, who led the initial search, never closed his file. Something about the disappearance didn't fit the pattern she'd seen over 20 years in the mountains. Accidents left traces: torn fabric, scuffed boots, disturbed soil. Ethan had simply evaporated. Holt returned to the site more than once, long after the case went cold. Each time she stood near the hollow well, she swore she could hear something beneath the wind, a low hum, like air moving through tunnels deep in the earth. She'd grown up around miners. She knew the sound of hollow space under rock. But there were no mapped caves in that section of the Cascades, at least none the Park Service admitted to. Meanwhile, rumors began to grow in nearby towns. Some locals claimed to see lights flickering in the forests after midnight, or hear metal striking stone where no construction existed. A hunter told the paper he'd found footprints, boot prints leading away from the trail and vanishing near an unmarked ridge. A geologist mentioned offhand that the Cascades were riddled with old ventilation shafts and tunnels from a century of abandoned mining. Most were sealed or forgotten, but some, he said, could still be accessed by those who knew where to look. By winter, Ethan's disappearance was buried under snow and bureaucracy. But the mountain never really forgets. The pines grew thicker over the parking lot, the signs weathered, the gravel road eroded until only the locals could find it. Sometimes hikers found small things: a torn strap, a rust carabiner, a film canister half buried in moss. None could be traced back to him, but every find stirred the same uneasy thought: maybe he hadn't fallen. Maybe someone had taken him. A year later, when the story finally broke again, it was in a single headline in the Salem Herald: missing hiker found alive in remote cave, chained and disoriented. Reporters rushed to piece together the fragments. But the first sentence of the sheriff's statement said everything: we found him deep inside Black Hollow Cave, 15 miles from his last known location. For a year, Ethan Cole had been beneath their feet, alive, imprisoned, and unseen. What happened in that darkness, what he endured, and what kind of man had held him there would become one of the most haunting mysteries Oregon had ever known. And somewhere between those mountains, where the wind carries whispers through the firs and down into the empty shafts of the old mines, it was said that if you listened closely enough, you could still hear the echo of chains moving against stone. The silver Jeep sat alone at the edge of the gravel lot, the kind of place only hikers and the occasional park ranger ever bothered to stop. Its metallic paint was dulled by a thin coat of dust and pine pollen, the windows filmed with the mist that rolled down from the Cascades each night. When the rescue team first found it, 2 days after Ethan Cole had failed to return, it looked untouched, almost staged. The driver's door was locked, the tires still clean enough to show no sign of panic or haste. Inside, everything was arranged the way a careful traveler might leave it: a half-full bottle of water in the cup holder, a folded rain jacket on the passenger seat, a laminated map marked with a single highlighter line leading up Mirror Peak Trail. Nothing suggested a struggle or an accident, yet the silence around the vehicle felt wrong, too still, too deliberate. Detective Sheriff Dana Holt crouched beside the Jeep that morning, her boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. The air smelled of pine sap and ozone, a storm having passed through hours earlier. She ran a hand over the hood. It was cool, meaning the car hadn't been driven for at least a day. He left it here, she murmured to the deputy standing beside her. But where did he go from here? A few yards away, the ground sloped sharply upward into a maze of evergreens, thick moss carpeting the trailhead sign. The logbook attached to the post bore Ethan's name and the date, written in his precise, blocky handwriting: E. Cole, 2-day hike, returning 1916. It was the last trace of him the world would have for nearly a year. The forensic team worked methodically, photographing every angle of the Jeep before unlocking it. Inside, they cataloged the essentials: a compass, spare socks sealed in a plastic bag, an emergency whistle, and a small leather notebook with smudged pencil notes about light exposure and aperture. The glove compartment held a few crumpled receipts from gas stations along Highway 97, one of them timed 7012 LAM, on the day he vanished. It was mundane evidence, the kind that told a story too ordinary to explain what followed. There was no blood, no broken glass, no torn fabric. Everything was neat, almost unnervingly so, as if he'd stepped out expecting to return within the hour. On the dashboard sat his camera case, empty. The strap was missing, too. Holt noted this in her field log, circling the words twice. Ethan never went anywhere without that camera. To the rescue volunteers who knew his reputation, it was practically part of his body. He'd once hiked 50 miles back to retrieve it after leaving it behind at a ridge. For him to leave it, or to vanish with it, meant something more than an accident. When they found no footprints leading away from the Jeep, Holt had the search widened. The rain had likely erased any shallow tracks, but even the dogs struggled to hold the scent. It began strong near the door handle, then weakened just beyond the first 100 meters of trail before dying completely in a patch of loose shale. That patch would haunt the investigation for months. Beneath it, the ground was unstable, riddled with unseen crevices that could open and close with the weather. Locals called it the Hollow Well, a place where things went missing. Old mining maps suggested there might once have been ventilation shafts nearby, remnants of the 19th century gold rush that carved into the Cascade foothills. But official records listed the area as geologically sealed, inaccessible. When Holt requested drone footage, the view revealed only uneven rock, trees bent from wind, and the narrow glint of water running through cracks. Nothing moved, nothing human. Back at the Jeep, another detail surfaced: Ethan's phone, wedged between the driver's seat and the console. Its battery was dead, but when charged, the data revealed one unsent text message typed at 7:18 a.m. Heading up now. No signal after this. It was addressed to his roommate, Alex. The message never sent because the mountains swallowed reception miles before the trailhead. Still, it placed him there, conscious, calm, and preparing for the hike he'd planned for weeks. The digital trail ended exactly where the physical one began. The surrounding lot bore other signs of recent used tire marks from ranger vehicles, boot prints from weekend hikers. Sorting through them was a nightmare. Still, one faint tread stood out to the forensics team: a narrow, deep imprint made by heavy work boots, pressed into the mud just behind the Jeep. It was older than the rescuers' prints, but newer than the rain from 2 nights before. No one could say for sure if it belonged to Ethan, though the size seemed larger than his documented shoe size. Holt ordered the cast saved anyway. It would be months before she knew how important that print really was. The Jeep was towed back to the sheriff's station in Bend, where technicians stripped it down piece by piece. They found a few stray pine needles wedged into the door seams and a smear of dry clay on the pedals, likely from Mira Peak's lower slopes. Under ultraviolet light, faint scratches appeared along the rear bumper, not from an accident, but from repeated contact with something metallic, maybe chains or gear hooks. To most eyes, they were meaningless. To Holt, they whispered of movement, of loading or unloading something heavy. She requested soil samples from beneath the chassis, comparing them to known mineral traces from the area. The results came back inconclusive, though one trace sample suggested a higher presence of calcite, common in limestone caves but rare in surface soil. The lab report flagged it as anomalous. The Jeep became a kind of shrine in the evidence yard. Weeks passed, then months. Reporters lost interest, other hikers disappeared. The cold case joined the quiet backlog of unsolved vanishings across Oregon's wilderness. Yet Holt kept returning to that vehicle. She'd sit in the driver's seat some nights after hours, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the empty passenger seat as if Ethan might materialize beside her. She imagined him adjusting his camera strap, glancing up through the windshield at the rising clouds, deciding whether to risk the weather. She tried to picture the moment he opened that door and stepped out. What caught his eye? What sound might have drawn him off the trail? A shout. A flash. The human brain always looked for motion in stillness, a reason behind disappearance. But here there was none. Then came the stories. Locals whispered that the Jeep wasn't alone for long after Ethan vanished. Campers reported seeing an old green SUV parked near the same lot days later, its windows blacked out, its engine running long after dusk. No license plate, no driver visible. One ranger dismissed it as gossip, but another quietly admitted she'd seen the same vehicle weeks before, on a restricted access road used only by geological surveyors. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if tracing paths known only to someone who'd memorized the bones of the mountain. The memory of that silver Jeep lingered, its presence too neat for the chaos that should have followed. Cars left in wilderness don't stay untouched for long. Dust, weather, and wildlife reclaim them quickly. But for days after Ethan's disappearance, the Jeep looked the same, almost preserved. Some said that was proof of nothing. Others felt it meant the person who took him came back, maybe to erase tracks, maybe to make sure no one else would notice too soon. When Sheriff Holt looked through the final photos of the Jeep before it was impounded, she noticed something she hadn't before. On the edge of the windshield, nearly invisible, a faint smear of soot. Soot didn't belong there, not from the engine, not from a storm. She sent the residue for analysis, and the report came back identifying traces of burned ceramic, the kind used in old mugs or cookware exposed to open fire. It was a small detail, insignificant on its own, but it would later connect to something found miles away in a cave where the mountain kept its secrets. For now, it was only a hint, a whisper left on glass. Standing before the empty parking lot weeks later, Holt thought of that Jeep and the man who had driven it there. She imagined him stepping into the mist, camera in hand, unaware that each step forward carried him closer not to the summit, but to a place buried beneath the mountain itself, a place no map had ever named. By the time the sun climbed over the Cascade ridges that morning, the road to Mirror Peak had already disappeared beneath the kind of fog that made the mountains seem alive. It wasn't the soft, dreamy kind of fog that rolls through valleys. This was thicker, heavier, a slow, moving tide that blurred every shape and muffled every sound. Ethan Cole's Jeep moved through it like a ghost. The last trace of his presence came not from his phone or a witness, but from the silent data stored in a cell tower just outside Sisters, Oregon. The signal blinked at 8:42 a.m., then went dark as though the mountain had swallowed it whole. Later, when investigators pulled the location records, they found his phone had been moving steadily northwest before it vanished, not erratic, not lost, just gone. The same morning, a clerk at a small gas station on Route 242 remembered a young man with dark hair and a camera bag slung across his shoulder. She said he seemed in a hurry but polite, the kind of traveler who spoke softly and looked past you when he talked, like his mind was somewhere else. He bought a coffee and a granola bar, then stood outside for a moment, staring toward the tree line. The station's surveillance camera caught him glancing up twice, first at the low-hanging clouds, then toward something unseen beyond the edge of the frame. When investigators later slowed down the footage, they thought they saw his mouth form a word. Some claimed he whispered "listen," though the soundless video left that to imagination. What mattered was that at 8:50 a.m., he climbed into his Jeep, started the engine, and drove off in the direction of the trailhead. No one ever saw him again. The Cascades are beautiful but unforgiving. The farther you go from the towns, the more the forest seems to close behind you, branches knitting together like a living curtain. The Mirror Peak Trail, especially that late in the season, was almost deserted. Most hikers avoided it when the weather turned. Flash storms were common, the slopes unpredictable. Rangers often joked that the mountain made its own decisions about who got to leave. Ethan knew that, of course. He'd hiked the region before, even camped near the same basin 2 summers earlier. But that morning felt different. The sky was already bruising with the promise of rain, and thunder rolled faintly from somewhere behind the peaks. According to the timestamps in the trail register, Ethan started his hike at exactly 9:07 a.m. His handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind of signature people make when they expect to see it again. E. Cole Solo 2 days. Below it, someone else had signed in earlier that morning, a pair of tourists from Idaho. They would later tell investigators they didn't remember crossing paths with anyone that day. The trail winds narrow through alpine meadows, crosses 2 creeks, and then ascends into the higher ridge where the air thins and the trees begin to vanish. Somewhere along the climb, Ethan disappeared between one breath and the next. What's strange about the mountains is how quickly they erase you. The wind, the rain, the endless movement of soil and water, everything conspires to make a person vanish as though they never existed. When the search teams later retraced his route, they found no footprints beyond the first bend. It was as if he'd stepped off the path and melted into the trees. Dogs caught his scent for less than half a mile before losing it entirely on a ridge of slick shale. The handler noted something odd. The dogs didn't just lose the scent, they recoiled from it, whining, pacing, refusing to advance beyond a certain point. To them, something about that patch of ground didn't smell right, not just human scent fading, but something foreign overlaying it. At the time, no one gave it much thought. Bad weather can confuse even the best trained animals. Still, the handler wrote it down in his logbook. Stopped near Hollow Well, dogs hesitant, possible contamination. That phrase, Hollow Well, would become a recurring ghost in every report afterward. The place was infamous among old rangers. Legend said it wasn't a well at all, but a fissure, a narrow sinkhole that opened and closed with rain. Decades earlier, 2 miners had vanished there after a storm. Locals claimed the mountain had swallowed them, though geologists dismissed it as unstable terrain. Whatever the truth, no one went near it anymore. If Ethan had strayed that way, he would have been off the marked trail, climbing through dense undergrowth and slippery stone. Why he would do that was a question no one could answer. He wasn't reckless, he planned everything. His friends said he could navigate by stars and smell approaching rain before clouds formed. He wasn't the kind to take shortcuts or wander aimlessly. So when his scent and tracks vanished near the hollow well, Holt's gut told her something else was at play. She'd seen panic before, people who ran in the wrong direction, slipped on wet rock, tried to backtrack, and lost their way. But those stories always left evidence: broken branches, discarded gear, footprints in mud. This one didn't. It was as if he'd been lifted from the earth. As the day wore on, the storm hit hard. Sheets of rain pounded the slopes, turning creeks into torrents. The sky cracked open, and thunder bounced off the granite faces like artillery. Rangers were forced to pull back before nightfall. The last thing one of them remembered was how the air smelled metallic, sharp, almost electrical, the way it smells after lightning strikes close. When they returned the next morning, the ground was washed clean. Whatever signs Ethan might have left were gone. The storm had erased him as completely as if it had been waiting for him. Later, data recovered from his phone's GACE showed his last known movement, a short burst of motion recorded just before the signal cut off. The phone pinged one last time, not from the trail, but from a point slightly east of it, deeper into the uncharted forest. It was less than a quarter-mile deviation, but that sliver of difference would prove critical. If he had turned east, he would have been walking toward an area once used for mining nearly a century ago, a place filled with abandoned shafts and hidden cavities long sealed from public maps. None of that was visible to the naked eye, just endless green forest and rock. Some believed he might have fallen into one of those shafts. Others thought he was caught in a landslide or attacked by wildlife. But no one could explain the absence of debris or why none of his gear was ever found. Even his camera, which he'd almost certainly had with him, vanished completely. That was the detail that gnawed at Holt most. Cameras fall, shatter, leave shards of glass, metal fragments, memory cards, something. But there was nothing. It wasn't lost, it was removed. As weeks turned into months, Holt went back to the trail more than once. She'd park near the same lot, hike to the same ridge, and stand in the same silence he must have heard that morning. She imagined the sound of his boots on gravel, the weight of the camera against his chest, the first hint of rain brushing his jacket. Maybe he heard something, a voice, a metallic sound, or a low hum from the earth that made him pause. Maybe he turned toward it. In the wilderness, instinct is everything. One wrong choice, one curious step can change a life. The last recorded moment of Ethan Cole's journey, that silent, dying signal at 8:42 a.m. became more than data. It became the line between two worlds, the one we understand and the one that waits beneath the surface, patient and unseen. Years later, investigators would trace that point again and again on maps, trying to make sense of why his phone went dead right there, in that exact spot. They would learn that below it, deep under the roots and stone, a network of unmapped cavities snaked through the mountain-old ventilation shafts, forgotten corridors, and one passage that led to a place called Black Hollow. But in 2018, all anyone knew was that a young man walked into the fog and the forest swallowed him. The mountains kept their silence, and somewhere beneath, something else began to wake. The search began the way all searches do, with urgency, hope, and the unshakable belief that a man couldn't just vanish into thin air. At first, the rescuers moved with confidence, their radios crackling, boots crunching against wet gravel, the smell of rain still hanging in the air. The trail to Mira Peak was a familiar one. It wound through alpine meadows and climbed into jagged ridges where the wind had a habit of carrying voices farther than they should go. When Sheriff Dana Holt arrived on scene, she expected a simple case, a hiker gone off-road, maybe injured, waiting for help. But as the hours stretched and no trace appeared, the weight of the mountain began to settle on everyone's shoulders. The first night was a storm. Rain hammered tents, wind screamed through the trees, and visibility dropped to nothing. The next morning, when the rangers regrouped, they found the ground scarred clean. Any footprints, drag marks, or signs of a fall were gone. The search dogs started at the parking lot where Ethan Cole's Jeep sat untouched, and followed the faint scent up the trail. It was steady at first, leading them past the visitor log and into the thick of the forest. Then, about half a mile in, the dogs stopped. Their noses went down, then up, then they began to circle, whining their tails low. The handler frowned and tried again. The scent ended abruptly at a patch of loose rock near the base of a slope. It was as if Ethan had walked into the mountain itself and disappeared. The handler's report later described the area in clinical language: unstable terrain, potential sink feature. But the locals had another name for it: the hollow well. It wasn't marked on maps, not officially, though everyone who'd spent enough time in the Cascades knew of it. A narrow depression that opened after heavy rain, swallowing whatever was unlucky enough to be nearby. Decades ago, a pair of prospectors had gone missing near that same ridge. Their tools were found days later, scattered in the mud, but not their bodies. The land had simply closed over them, sealing whatever story they carried. No one went near it anymore. Even the trees seemed to grow away from it, their roots curling like frightened fingers around its edge. As the days passed, the search radius expanded. Rangers, volunteers, and National Guard helicopters combed the area from sunrise to dusk. The air smelled of fuel and wet pine. The ground, slick with moss, gave way beneath boots. They scouted ridgelines, drainage basins, and narrow gullies where lost hikers had turned up before. But this time there was nothing. Not a tent, not a scrap of fabric, not even a broken branch to suggest a struggle. One ranger, an older man named Deke Morrison, who'd worked the Cascades for 30 years, told Holt quietly, "The mountain doesn't take people this clean. Something else does." She didn't write it in the report, but the words stayed with her. Every afternoon the wind would rise, carrying low, hollow sounds from the ridges, echoes of rock slides, maybe, or something else. The dogs refused to go near the hollow well after the second day. They'd pull at their leashes, whimpering, straining backward. One even broke free, sprinting back toward the parking lot and refusing to return. The handler swore it was the scent, something metallic, he said, not blood but clothes. He described it as cold, a strange choice of word, but no one laughed. In the wilderness, instinct sometimes knows more than reason. On the fourth day, the first civilian volunteers arrived, hikers from Bend and Eugene who'd heard about the missing photographer on the news. They carried their own maps and flashlights, moving in small groups, calling Ethan's name until their voices turned hoarse. Some claimed to have seen shapes through the fog, quick movements just beyond the tree lane. But when they reached the spot, nothing was there. One volunteer later told Holt, "It felt like the forest was answering us, like it didn't want to be disturbed." She smiled politely and moved on, though she felt the same unease. By the end of the week, the search had become mechanical: grid patterns, coordinate calls, air sweeps. The weather turned colder, the rain less frequent, but the fog thicker. Holt stood on a ridge overlooking the basin, her binoculars useless in the white veil below. Somewhere under that fog was the man they were supposed to find. The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of black-green needles and stone. It occurred to her that if Ethan had fallen, he would have been found by now. People don't vanish that completely, unless someone wanted them to. On the sixth day, they brought in thermal drones. At night, their red lights blinked like small stars above the canopy. The monitors showed the usual animal movement, heat spots from deer or bear. No human signature appeared. But one drone passing near the hollow well briefly picked up a faint thermal echo, too steady to be wildlife, too cold to be a living body. Then it was gone. The technician marked it as equipment error. Holt wasn't convinced. She ordered another flight, but rain grounded the drones before they could fly again. By now, the search had attracted news crews. Cameras lined the trailhead, reporters asking if foul play was suspected. Holt told them what she always did at this stage: we were exploring all possibilities. What she didn't say was that she already believed foul play was the only possibility left. The absence of evidence wasn't a void, it was a pattern, a deliberate removal. She'd seen enough disappearances to know when nature was guilty and when something human had intervened. 2 weeks in, the official operation scaled back. The volunteers went home, the helicopters stopped flying. The hollow well was taped off, declared unsafe for foot travel. On paper, the case shifted from active search to missing person under review. But Holt didn't close her file. Late one night, she drove back to the trailhead alone. The fog was thick again, rolling low across the ground. She parked beside the empty lot and walked to where the trail began. The sign creaked in the wind. For a long moment, she listened, not for footsteps or voices, but for something else. The air felt heavy, charged, like the pause before lightning. Somewhere below, she swore she heard a faint metallic rattle, echoing from the depths of the ridge. She shone her flashlight across the slope, catching glimpses of stone and tangled roots. Then something glinted, small, circular, half buried in mud. She crouched and brushed the dirt away. It was a camera lens, cracked but unmistakably professional. The brand matched Ethan's. Her pulse quickened, but when she lifted it, the lens cap was screwed on tight, almost too tight. Inside was nothing but black, no camera body, no strap, no fingerprints, just an empty shell. When the evidence team examined it later, they found trace residue inside the threads of the cap suit, mixed with fine grains of limestone dust. The report noted the combination was not typical of surface exposure, but consistent with material found in deep subterranean environments. No one knew what that meant, not yet, but Holt did. She'd grown up near mines. She knew the scent of stone that had never seen sunlight. Months later, when the mountain-thawed and hikers returned to Mirror Peak, some claimed to hear strange echoes near the hollow well, not wind, but something rhythmic, mechanical, like the faint clinking of metal against rock. The sheriff's office dismissed it as folklore, the kind of superstition that always blooms after tragedy. Still, a quiet rumor spread through the small towns at the foot of the Cascades. They said the mountain hadn't taken Ethan Cole, someone had, and that somewhere in the deep places beneath the ridges, where maps no longer reach, something was still moving, slow and deliberate, as if waiting for another traveler to stray too far from the trail. A year passed before the mountain gave up its secret. Seasons came and went across the Cascades, snow burying the ridges in silence, spring thawing the rivers. Summer filling the valleys with tourists who never knew that a man had once vanished where they now hiked. The story of Ethan Cole had become a ghost among locals, whispered in bars and ranger stations. Some said he'd run away, others believed the mountain took him, like it had taken so many before. Sheriff Dana Holt still kept his file open on her desk, though the paper had begun to curl at the edges. There were nights she'd drive up toward Mirror Peak and sit in her truck with the engine off, staring at the tree line as if waiting for it to move. But nothing ever did. The mountain remained mute, patient, unbothered by human questions. Then, on a warm September morning in 2019, 3 members of the Cascade Caving Society met at a ranger post outside Oak Ridge. Their names were Travis Henson, Leo Park, and Samantha Ortiz. They weren't professionals, just enthusiasts drawn to the unseen places beneath the earth. For months, they'd been mapping sections of the Black Hollow Cave system, a labyrinth of limestone tunnels that stretched for miles under the western slopes. Most of it was documented, at least, the parts safe enough to explore, but Black Hollow had a reputation. Its deepest branches shifted after heavy rain, sometimes closing, sometimes opening entirely new corridors. The rangers kept warning signs posted, though that never stopped the curious. The group's plan that day was simple: to check a narrow section known among locals as the Blind Arm, a dead-end passage they believed might connect to a larger chamber. Travis, the oldest of the 3, logged their departure at 8:42 a.m. in his field notebook. The air was cool, the sun still low, mist curling like smoke through the evergreens. They packed light helmets, headlamps, climbing gear, and a shortwave radio that barely held a signal once underground. According to the log, they entered the main mouth of Black Hollow at 9:10. The rock swallowed their voices almost instantly. Inside, the world was different. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, the air smelled of mineral and wet stone. The first chamber opened into a narrow throat where water dripped in a slow, constant rhythm. Samantha went first, marking their route with reflective tape. They joked at first, their laughter echoing strangely through the tunnel, but as the light from the entrance faded, their voices lowered. At 9:23, Travis made a note in his log: unusual odor, metallic, musty, air temperature decreasing. They assumed it was iron deposits or trapped groundwater until the smell grew sharper, almost chemical. The deeper they went, the stronger it became, and with it came something else, the faintest sound of metal scraping against rock. Leo stopped, shining his beam along the right-hand wall. The stone there was scratched, long, parallel marks running horizontally as if someone had dragged a chain across it over and over. The grooves were fresh, the stone edges still sharp. Travis photographed them, making another entry in his notebook. They debated turning back. The air was heavy, the smell worsening, but curiosity won. The passage ahead narrowed into a crack just wide enough for one person at a time. Samantha squeezed through first, her light bobbing as she crawled. What she saw on the other side stopped her cold. The floor was covered in fine dust, marked not by footprints but by long, thin trails, twin lines running parallel, like something had been dragged. Chains, she thought. They extended deeper into the darkness until the beam of her light caught a shape ahead, a shallow depression carved into the rock. It's almost like a man-made alcove. In it sat what she first assumed was a dummy, slumped against the wall, motionless. She called out for Travis and Leo, her voice cracking. When they crawled through and shined their lights, the truth hit like a physical blow. It wasn't a dummy. The man was alive, barely. He sat with his back to the wall, arms bound by a thick chain that ran through iron bolts drilled directly into the rock. His skin was gray with dust, cracked like parchment. His lips were dry, eyes open but unfocused, staring at nothing. For a moment, none of them moved. The only sound was their breathing and the soft rattle of the chain when the man tried to shift. Samantha knelt beside him, speaking softly. He didn't answer. His pulse fluttered weakly under her fingers. When she asked his name, he murmured something unintelligible, a whisper more breath than sound. Leo grabbed the radio, fumbling with the antenna until he caught a faint signal. "Mayday, this is the Cascade Caving Society. We have a live subject, repeat, live subject, male, late 20s, found restrained underground. We need rescue." Static swallowed most of the message, but somewhere up top, the signal reached a ranger station. The dispatcher logged the call at 10:07 m. It took nearly 2 hours for the rescue team to reach them. The terrain was unstable, the tunnel too narrow for stretchers. The rescuers had to cut through the bolts with portable saws, sparks flying in the stale air. The sound made the man flinch, his breathing shallow and uneven. He said nothing, not even when the last chain fell away. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, lifted him through the crawl space, and carried him into the sunlight for the first time in what would later be determined to be almost a year. Outside, the medics worked fast. His body temperature was dangerously low, his skin marred with deep bruises and scarring around his wrists and ankles. There were old fractures in his ribs and collarbone, long healed without medical care. His blood work showed extreme anemia and severe malnutrition. The doctors said it was a miracle he was alive at all. When they tried to question him, he only repeated fragment sounds that didn't form words, syllables broken and meaningless. He seemed terrified of the sky, shielding his face from the light. That night, the hospital in Salem confirmed his identity through DNA. It was Ethan Cole, the same man who'd walked into Mirror Peak Trail a year earlier and vanished without a trace. News spread quickly. Missing photographer found alive in Oregon cave. Reporters flooded the hospital parking lot, their cameras pointed at the building like it was a shrine. But Ethan couldn't tell anyone what had happened. His memory was a blank wall. He didn't remember the trail, the storm, or the months between. Not even his own name at first. Sheriff Holt arrived before dawn, her badge tucked under her jacket. She stood outside his room, watching through the glass. He was asleep, hooked to his lines, his face thin and pale. The steady beep of the monitor was the only sound. She didn't know what she expected, relief, maybe, or closure, but all she felt was unease. The doctors said his hair was shorter than it should have been after a year. His nails had been cut. His skin bore marks from metal restraints that were too recent to be 12 months old. Someone had taken care of him in their own twisted way. Someone had kept him alive. The following day, a forensic team returned to Black Hollow. The section where Ethan was found showed no signs of natural collapse or prior use. The bolts were new, less than a year old, the metal still clean. Near the alcove, they discovered fragments of broken chain, a ceramic shard with soot marks, and a faint trace of human ash along the rock surface. There were no tools, no food, no personal belongings. Whoever had brought Ethan there had left nothing behind but silence. When Holt stood in that cave days later, helmet light sweeping across the stone, she felt the cold all the way down to her bones. The air was still heavy with that same metallic scent the cavers had described. She could almost hear it, the faint rhythm of water dripping from the ceiling, the echo of chains, and in that sound something like breath. She looked at the wall where the bolts had been cut and thought about how close the world above had been, just a few hundred feet of rock separating sunlight from the place where a man had been buried alive. Outside, the forest looked calm again, but Holt knew better. The mountains had given one of their secrets back, but only because something deeper had decided to let go. The discovery of Ethan Cole should have been an ending. Instead, it was the beginning of a far darker story. When the first rescue reached the mouth of Black Hollow Cave, the morning mist still clung to the trees like smoke. It was 1:20 p.m., and the team had been moving nonstop for almost 2 hours, guided only by the cavers' voices over the weak radio signal that cracked and faded with every step deeper underground. Sheriff Dana Holt arrived with the second group, her boots sinking into the damp earth as she looked at the jagged hole that gaped in the mountainside. The cave entrance was half hidden behind ferns and fallen rock, the kind of place you'd pass without noticing if you weren't looking for it. A heavy silence hung there, the kind that comes when the forest is listening. Holt felt it immediately. The air was colder, heavier, carrying that same metallic tang she remembered from the hollow well a year earlier. It was as if the mountain exhaled something unnatural. Inside, the rescuers worked by flashlight. The beam of their lights cut through the darkness, illuminating rough stone slick with condensation. The air grew colder the deeper they went. They followed the reflective tape the cavers had left behind, inching through the narrow passage until the tunnel widened into a small chamber. That was where they found him sitting slumped against the wall, his head tilted forward, the chain across his chest clinking faintly as he breathed. It took a moment for them to realize he was alive. His skin was a chalky gray, stretched thin over sharp bones, his hair matted with dust. When one of the rescuers called out, he flinched violently, eyes darting toward the light like an animal cornered. They moved slowly, careful not to startle him. The bolts holding the chains were driven deep into the rock, the steel still gleaming where it met the stone. Whoever had installed them had known exactly what they were doing. It took a portable cutter to slice through the links, sparks bouncing off the cave walls in tiny bursts of light. The man whimpered softly but didn't speak. Every sound seemed to hurt him, the echo of footsteps, the scrape of metal, the sudden brightness of the flashlight beams. One medic crouched beside him, checking his pulse. "He's breathing," she said, her voice shaking. "Barely, but he's alive." The operation to get him out took nearly an hour. They had to crawl backward through the narrowest part of the tunnel, passing him hand to hand like something fragile that might shatter with one wrong move. When they finally emerged into daylight, the man clutched his face with both hands, as if the sun were burning him. The medics wrapped him in a blanket, easing him onto a stretcher. His lips moved, but no words came out, just a rasp, a whisper too soft to catch. Someone thought he said down, but it could have been anything. At the field station set up near the base of the mountain, the medical team worked quickly. His temperature was dangerously low, blood pressure erratic, dehydration severe. There were marks around his wrists and ankles, deep, circular scars that told the story of months, maybe longer, spent in restraints. Some were old and healed, or others were raw and fresh. The doctors found signs of multiple fractures, ribs, collarbone, a dislocated shoulder, all healed improperly without splints or casts. His fingernails were unevenly trimmed, his hair roughly cut, as though someone had done it with a dull blade. It was impossible to reconcile the image of this broken man with the photographs of the young hiker who'd once smiled beside alpine lakes, camera in hand. Yet when they ran the test, the results were unmistakable. The man they'd found in the cave was Ethan Cole. News of his discovery spread faster than wildfire. By nightfall, reporters camped outside the hospital in Salem, flashing lights bouncing off glass doors, their voices cutting through the hum of ambulances and generators. The story was too strange to ignore: a missing hiker found alive after a year underground, chained to a wall like a prisoner. The sheriff's office released only the bare facts. He had been rescued from a remote section of the Black Hollow Cave system, was in stable condition, and was being treated for exhaustion and trauma. They did not mention the chains or the bolts, or the unsettling precision with which he had been confined. Inside the hospital, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. He spoke little, his eyes darting around the room as though expecting the walls to close in. The psychiatrist assigned to his case described him as alert but detached, unable to recognize his surroundings or recall his own name. When asked simple questions, "Do you know where you are? Do you remember what happened?" he either stared blankly or whispered single fragmented words. Sometimes he repeated the same syllables over and over like a broken record: "Dark, dark, down one night." A nurse heard him mutter something longer, something that sounded like, he said, "Don't look up." She wrote it in her report, though no one could say what it meant. Sheriff Holt spent hours reading the medical notes. The inconsistencies unsettled her. Ethan's body showed signs of captivity, but not of wilderness survival. His skin wasn't weathered, his beard barely grown, his nails trimmed within the last few weeks. It was as if someone had kept him alive, fed him, restrained him, and maintained him only to abandon him shortly before the cavers arrived. The timeline didn't add up. If he'd been missing a year, why were the marks on his wrists so new? Why was his hair cut so recently? And who had installed those chains deep inside a cave system not listed on any modern map? A forensic team returned to the site 2 days later. The chamber where Ethan had been found was barely wide enough for 3 people to stand shoulder to shoulder. On the floor, they discovered a small ceramic fragment with soot on one side, likely from a mug or bowl used over a flame. Nearby, embedded in the dust, was a single-button plastic dark brown from clothing not belonging to Ethan. They also noted something stranger: the chains were spotless. In a place where every surface was coated with years of dust and mineral buildup, the metal shone as if polished. Someone had touched them recently. The scientists tested air samples and found elevated levels of carbon dioxide, suggesting the cave had been sealed for long periods. Yet there were no signs of natural blockage, no collapse, no debris. Someone had controlled access to it. The deeper investigators looked, the more deliberate everything appeared. The bolts were positioned evenly, the chain length calculated to restrict movement but allow limited circulation. Even the alcove in which Ethan had been seated bore chisel marks, not random erosion, but human workmanship. When Holt reviewed the photos, she noticed something else: of faint impressions on the wall beside where Ethan had been sitting. They looked like fingerprints pressed into dust, large, distinct, not his. They ran horizontally, as though someone had braced a hand there while leaning close. The prints ended abruptly, smudged into the rock. She stared at them for a long time before closing the folder. Whoever had done this hadn't just known the cave, they'd built part of it. Back at the hospital, Ethan's condition stabilized. He began eating small portions, responding to commands, but his mind remained fractured. When shown photos of his family, he didn't react. When Holt entered the room, however, something shifted. His eyes followed her, and his hand twitched slightly, as if trying to form a gesture. She asked if he remembered the trail, the storm, the cave. No answer. She leaned closer, repeating softly, "Ethan, do you remember who put you there?" For the first time, he looked directly at her. His voice was barely audible. "He's still there," he whispered. Those words clung to Holt's thoughts long after she left. She replayed them over and over, each time hearing something different in the phrasing: not fear, but certainty. It wasn't just that someone had held him captive, it was that whoever it was might still be in those mountains, still watching. That night, a storm rolled over the Cascades again, thunder shaking the hospital windows. Holt sat in her office staring at the map spread across her desk: Mirror Peak, the Hollow Well, Black Hollow Cave. 3 points that formed a rough triangle. Ethan Cole had vanished in the first, been found in the last, and somewhere between them lay whatever truth the mountain refused to give up. As the rain beat against the glass, she made a decision. The rescue was over. Now it was time for an investigation. In the days that followed Ethan Cole's rescue, the hospital became a fortress of whispers. Reporters still crowded outside the main entrance, flashing cameras whenever a doctor appeared, but inside the mood was hushed, clinical, and uneasy. Everyone who worked on his case sensed that something about this man, about where he'd been, was profoundly wrong. The physicians could treat the body, the dehydration, the fractures, the anemia. But the mind, that was another story. When they spoke to him, it was like talking to someone who had been carved out and left hollow. Karen Lister, the attending psychiatrist, had seen trauma before: soldiers, accident survivors, victims of captivity, but nothing quite like Ethan. His vitals stabilized within 48 hours, yet his memory was still a shattered glass. He could recall how to speak, how to hold utensils, how to drink from a straw. He knew what a window was, what a bed was, what a face looked like, but when asked who he was or what had happened, his expression emptied. Sometimes his eyes flickered with recognition, a reflex, maybe a flash of something returning, only for it to fade seconds later. He was living inside the shell of his own life. The nurses kept notes of his behavior. He slept in short, restless bursts, jerking awake at the smallest sounds. He refused to be left alone in the dark. If the lights dimmed, he'd press himself into the corner of the bed, trembling until they came back on. Once, a maintenance worker accidentally dropped a metal tray outside his room, and the noise sent Ethan into a fit of panic. He'd ripped the Ev out of his arm and tried to crawl under the bed, covering his ears like a child. When the nurses managed to calm him, he whispered something over and over: "No chains, not again, not again." It was clear his fear wasn't just of the past, it was of memory itself. The doctors tried light sedation, hypnosis, even mild sensory therapy. Nothing worked. Every time they nudged at the gaps in his recollection, he withdrew further, curling inward like someone afraid of what might surface if he looked too closely. His muscles were strong enough to walk, but when they encouraged him to take a few steps down the hallway, he refused. The windows unsettled him. He didn't like to see the sky. Sheriff Dana Holt visited every morning, standing at the foot of his bed, patient and quiet. She asked simple things. Did he remember Mirror Peak? The jeep, the storm. Each time he just shook his head or stared past her. But on the fourth day something changed. She placed one of his old photographs on the bedside table, a shot of Mirror Lake taken the summer before his disappearance. The moment his eyes found it, his breathing quickened. He reached for it slowly, tracing the image with trembling fingers. His lips parted as if to speak, but all that came out was a low murmur. He said, "Don't look up." The phrase matched what the nurse had recorded earlier. Holt felt a chill crawl up her neck. "Who said that, Ethan?" she asked. He didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, unfocused, like he was seeing something she couldn't. That night, Holt stayed long after visiting hours, reading through the latest forensic reports from the cave. The inconsistencies gnawed at her. Ethan's hair had been cut recently, no more than a few weeks ago. His nails trimmed, his wounds cleaned. Someone had cared for him, and not out of kindness. There were traces of sedatives in his bloodstream, heavy ones, the kind used to keep someone docile without putting them fully under. The lab confirmed that the ceramic shard found in the cave bore traces of caffeine and human saliva. It had once been a mug used recently, most likely by someone other than Ethan. Whoever had kept him there hadn't lived like an animal. They'd had structure, supplies, control. As these details surfaced, the hospital became a hive of controlled secrecy. Federal investigators arrived quietly, claiming jurisdiction over the case. They met with Holt in private, asking about local hermits, miners, anyone who knew the old tunnels. But Holt knew those men: recluses, drunks, scavengers. None of them had the precision or resources to orchestrate what she'd seen in that cave. This was something different, colder, more methodical. Whoever did this had built an environment, not a prison. It was deliberate. On the fifth night, Ethan's condition worsened. He began murmuring in his sleep, thrashing violently until the nurses restrained him. When Dreer questioned him under mild sedation, he described flashes of darkness, not dreams, but sensations, the sound of dripping water, footsteps that never echoed right, the metallic rhythm of chains moving. There was light, he whispered, but not sunlight, white light. It buzzed. The words chilled her. Battery lamps, she thought. Someone had installed artificial lighting in that chamber. Later, when Lister met with Holt in the hospital cafeteria, she set down her coffee untouched. He wasn't just kept there, she said. He was managed, monitored. Someone was watching him for a long time. Holt didn't respond right away. She was staring out the window at the night sky, where the distant ridges of the Cascades lay black and silent. If that's true, she said finally, then whoever it was didn't stop with him. You don't build something like that for one person. The next morning, Ethan had another episode. A nurse found him standing barefoot beside the bed, staring at the reflection of the fluorescent light in the window. "He's here," he whispered when she asked what he was looking at. He said he never leaves. After that, he refused to sleep. He'd sit up for hours, staring into corners, whispering words no one could decipher. The staff began covering the windows at night to calm him, but the gesture didn't help much. It was as if he still heard something no one else could, faint echoes carried from somewhere deep underground. Meanwhile, Holt pushed for an expanded investigation of the Black Hollow cave system. The geologists who examined it reported something strange, a section of tunnel extending far beyond the mapped boundaries, as if a new corridor had been carved or reopened by hand. The pattern of the chisel marks was recent. No one could explain how it got there or who had done it. The entrance to that extension was sealed within days for safety, though Holt suspected the real reason was containment. Too many people were starting to ask questions the state wasn't ready to answer. By the end of the week, Ethan's progress plateaued. The doctors said his body would recover, but his mind might never fully return. Holt visited one last time that Friday before the transfer to a rehabilitation facility. She found him sitting quietly by the window, hands folded in his lap, sunlight falling across his face. For the first time, he looked almost peaceful. She told him they'd found new evidence, that they were going to keep searching until they discovered who did this. He didn't turn his head, just said softly, "You won't find him. He finds you." Holt left the room shaken. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the ridges, that same low, rumbling growl she'd heard near Mirror Peak a year earlier. She looked back once at the hospital window, half expecting to see him watching her. But there was only her own reflection staring back, pale and uncertain. She didn't know it yet, but Ethan Cole's rescue hadn't closed the story. It had opened the door to something much older, much deeper, and far from finished. By the time Sheriff Dana Holt formally reopened the investigation, the story of Ethan Cole had already begun to drift into myth. The public saw it as a miracle, a man found alive after a year in darkness, but for Holt, it was a reminder that the mountain had only given back what it no longer needed. The case file grew heavier by the day, full of photographs, maps, and medical reports that answered nothing. Every night she read the same lines over and over: chains recently installed, hair trimmed. Marks suggest prolonged confinement, but recent restraint. The evidence whispered one truth: someone had kept him alive, but refused to say who or why. Her first move was to push the investigation out of the hospital and into the mountains again. She brought together a small team she trusted: Deputy Reeve, forensic specialist Maya Chen, and 2 National Park rangers who had assisted during the first search. They met in the sheriff's narrow office one morning in late September, the air thick with the scent of coffee and rain-soaked pine. On the board behind Holt's desk, 3 maps were pinned side by side: Mirror Peak Trail, the Hollowell sector, and the Black Hollow cave system. She drew a red triangle connecting them. "He went missing here," she said, tapping the trailhead. "He was found here," tapping the cave. "And the hollow well sits dead center. Whatever happened to him, it started somewhere between these points." They began with the locals, the recluses and hermits, who lived in the thin strip of land where civilization faded into wilderness. There weren't many left in that part of Oregon, but those who remained were known to the rangers: miners, hunters, old-timers who built shacks on abandoned property, men who had traded company for silence. One name came up more than once: Earl Granger, a retired miner who lived in a trailer near the base of Red Valley. Granger was a legend among rangers, a man who knew every slope, every forgotten mine shaft. He was also known for his temper. 2 years earlier, he'd chased off a group of campers with a shotgun after they pitched a tent near his property. Said the woods weren't for tourists, one ranger recalled. Holt and Reeve drove out to see him. The road twisted upward through thick evergreens until it opened into a clearing littered with rusted mining equipment and scrap metal. Granger's trailer sat crooked on cinder blocks, a pipe of smoke curling from a tin chimney. When he answered the door, he looked every bit his reputation: a man carved from stone and whiskey, beard tangled, eyes sharp and suspicious. Holt introduced herself and explained why they were there. Granger listened without interrupting, his hand resting on the doorframe. When she mentioned the Black Hollow cave, he stiffened. "You don't go poking around there," he said. "That place ain't right. It moves." "Moves?" Holt asked. He nodded toward the forest. "You think it's just a cave, but it ain't. It's a vein. You can hear it shift sometimes down under the hills. That's why no one maps it. The mountain covers its own tracks." Reeve asked if he'd seen anyone in the area around the time Ethan disappeared. Granger shook his head. "People come and go. Some don't come back. That's the mountain's business." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. When Holt asked to look around, he refused flatly. "You won't find what you're looking for here," he said, "and if you re-smart, you'll stop looking." Driving back down the road, Reeve muttered, "Creepy old bastard." But Holt wasn't sure. Granger had been defensive, yes, but not guilty. His fear felt genuine, like that of someone who'd seen something he couldn't explain and didn't want to remember. The next name on the list was Caleb Dorn, a logger who worked the northern edge of the valley. Dorn was younger, volatile, known for drinking and brawling at the local bar. When Holt and Chen questioned him, he met them with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You think I chained some hiker in a cave?" he said, laughing. "Hell, I don't even go near those holes. You fall in one of those, you redone." But when Holt pressed him about the hollow well, his face darkened. "Don't talk about that place," he snapped. "You don't know what you're stirring up." Then, softer, almost to himself, he said, "It watches you." Holt made a note of the phrasing. He said, "Not I heard, not people say, someone specific." "Who said that, Caleb?" she asked. But he wouldn't answer. He just stared at her until she and Chen left. Over the next few days, the team cross-referenced property records, old mining permits, and geological surveys. One area stood out, a cluster of sealed mine shafts near Red Valley, all decommissioned decades earlier after multiple cave-ins. The records were incomplete, but several maps mentioned subterranean ventilation tunnels connecting them. Those tunnels ran close to Black Hollow. When Chen compared the coordinates, she found something chilling. The shaft closest to the hollow well had been sealed not by collapse, but by deliberate filling. Someone had closed it off manually, pouring concrete into the entrance. The date, late 2017, 2 months after Ethan's disappearance. Holt contacted the construction company listed on the permit, but they denied involvement. No one could say who had ordered the closure. The paperwork had been signed with an illegible signature and a falsified state seal. It was clear now someone knew those tunnels, used them, and then hid them. By early October, the investigation's focus shifted from nature to intent. This wasn't a lost hiker found by chance. It was a criminal act buried beneath a year of silence. Holt worked late in her office, surrounded by files and topographic maps. She traced the triangle again and again, the pencil pressing deeper into the paper each time. There had to be a link, someone who lived between those points, someone who understood the terrain like a blueprint. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the precision of the bolts in that cave, the clean metal, the symmetrical placement. Whoever did that had been trained, maybe military, maybe engineering. The next morning, a ranger brought her a tip. A store clerk in Oak Ridge remembered a man who came in the day before Ethan vanished. He'd bought a heavy chain, industrial carabiners, nylon straps, and a pack of over-the-counter sedatives. Paid cash. The clerk said he wasn't a hiker. He moved too deliberately, like someone on a schedule. When Holt asked for a description, the clerk thought for a moment. Tall, he said. 40, maybe 50. Wore a dark jacket, cap pulled low. Kept looking over his shoulder. They pulled the security footage from the store's camera. The timestamp read 6:47 p.m. The man's face was mostly hidden by the brim of his hat, but his build was unmistakable, lean, upright, confident. The camera caught his car briefly as he left, an old SUV, dark green or khaki, parked at an angle as if to avoid the camera's direct view. Holt paused the video on a single frame. There was something about the posture, the composure, too calculated to be random. Whoever he was, he had known exactly what he was doing. That night, as the rain returned to the valley, Holt sat alone at her desk, staring at the frozen image on her monitor. The figure in the frame seemed to stare back at her through the distortion, his face swallowed by shadow. Behind him, the glass door of the store reflected the faint outline of the mountains, and for a fleeting second, she could swear there was another shape there, something taller, darker, standing just beyond the light. The storm outside deepened, thunder shaking the windows. Holt switched off the monitor, but the ghost of the image lingered in her mind, the man, the chains, the unspoken logic behind it all. She'd spent her career chasing killers who acted out of anger or impulse. This one was different. He didn't act out of rage. He acted out of purpose, and that purpose, she realized, had started long before Ethan Cole ever set foot on Mirror Peak. The mountain hadn't just hidden a crime, it had sheltered a design. The investigation began to narrow its focus like a tightening noose. After weeks of chasing leads through abandoned mines and ghost towns, Sheriff Dana Holt's team had managed to reduce the pool of suspects to 2 men, both recluses, both with pasts as rough as the land they lived on. One was Earl Granger, the ex-miner who spoke of the mountain as if it were alive. The other was Caleb Dorn, a logger-turned-drifter with a reputation for violence. But suspicion was not proof, and Holt knew how easily the wilderness could turn rumor into gospel. The key would be evidence, something physical, something human. The days grew shorter as fall crept down the slopes of the Cascades. Morning fog swallowed the valley, erasing sound and color until only the hiss of rain against leaves remained. Holt drove out to Dorna's property one afternoon when the clouds were low enough to touch the treetops. His cabin sat deep in the woods, a 2-room structure pieced together from rotting timber and rusted tin. The yard was littered with tools, hunting traps, and piles of firewood stacked like barricades. She killed the engine and listened. No movement, no voices, not even the hum of a generator. It was too quiet. When she knocked, there was no answer. She called his name twice, louder each time. Still nothing. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old smoke and something sore underneath. A kerosene lamp burned on a table beside a bottle of whiskey and a half-eaten plate of beans. Someone had been here recently. She stepped deeper inside, flashlight sweeping over the walls. Animal skulls hung on nails, a collection of rusted saw blades. A calendar stuck open to the month Ethan had disappeared. Each day up to the 15th was crossed out in red marker. The rest of the month was blank. She was reaching for her radio when she heard the floorboards creak behind her. Dorn stood in the doorway, a hunting knife in one hand and an expression that neither surprise nor fear, just irritation. "You don't knock much, Sheriff," he said, voice low and calm. Holt kept her stance steady. "You weren't answering," she replied. "You've been avoiding my calls," he shrugged, setting the knife on the counter. "You've been asking the same damn questions." "I told you already I don't know anything about your missing man." But Holt wasn't here to ask the same questions. She wanted to watch him move, listen to the cadence of his voice. He was wiry, his hands calloused and stained from years of work. No hesitation, no nervous tics. Still, something in his eyes betrayed a constant edge, like a man used to listening for danger even in silence. She asked where he'd been during the week Ethan disappeared. "Working the line north of Red Valley," he said. "You can ask my foreman." But when she did later, the foreman said Caleb hadn't shown up for 3 straight days. She asked about the hollow well. The air between them shifted, his jaw tightened, his voice dropped. "That's not a place you go," he said. "It's where the mountain breathes." Holt pressed him, asking what that meant, but he just stared at her and muttered, "You wouldn't understand." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You keep digging around there, Sheriff, you'll find more than you want." She left soon after, but not before noticing a set of muddy boots by the door caked with pale gray soil. Later, a geologist confirmed the soil didn't match the local terrain. It contained traces of calcite and limestone minerals found only near the deeper parts of the Black Hollow system. When confronted, Dorn claimed he'd gone hunting near a quarry, but there were no quarries in that direction. It was enough to secure a warrant. The search of Dorn's property turned up what the team expected: hunting gear, tools, food supplies, but also things that didn't belong. A spool of steel wire, a pack of medical syringes, a set of carabiners identical to those sold at the Oak Ridge hardware store where the mysterious buyer had purchased chains. The serial numbers matched. Still, Dorn denied everything. "I fix my own gear," he said. "That don't make me a kidnapper." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes stayed hard. The interrogation room smelled of rain and cigarette smoke. Dorn sat slouched in the chair, arms crossed, as Holt paced slowly in front of him. She laid out the photos one by one: the bolts from the cave, the chain fragments, the cracked ceramic mug, the hardware store receipts. "You see, these things tell a story," she said. "And it's a story you fit into whether you like it or not." He smirked. "You think you've got me figured out, but you don't know the half of it." "Then tell me," she said. He leaned forward, the smirk fading. "You think I took that boy? You think I built those chains? But that place, that cave, it was already there. Someone else did that long before he ever walked into the woods. Ivy heard it. Sometimes at night, the ground hums. You feel it if you listen close. Like something moving underneath." He looked up at her with eyes too calm. "That mountain's hollow, Sheriff, and what lives inside don't die." Holt wanted to dismiss it as madness, but something in his tone kept her silent. He wasn't lying, not exactly. He believed every word. Still, belief didn't clear him. The chain evidence alone tied him to the case, but when the lab reports came back, they shattered her confidence. The DNA on the metal wasn't his. It wasn't Ethan's either. It belonged to an unknown third person, a male, older, unregistered in any national database. Whoever that man was, he'd been in that cave handling those chains. Dorn was released due to lack of evidence, and just like that, he vanished. His cabin sat empty when deputies returned 3 days later. The lamp was still burning, the whiskey bottle half full. No sign of struggle, no footprints, no vehicle tracks leaving the property. He'd simply walked into the woods and disappeared. The town of Oak Ridge buzzed with rumors again. Some said Holt had scared him off. Others swore he'd gone back to the hollow well and never come out. A week later, a hunter reported hearing a scream echoing through the valley, not an animal's. Not quite human either, followed by the distant sound of metal striking stone. Holt ordered another sweep of the area, but the weather turned, flooding the trails with fog and mud. No trace of Caleb Dorn was ever found. That night, Holt sat alone in her office, reviewing the tape of Dorn's interrogation. She replayed one section over and over, the moment before he leaned forward. His voice was low, almost reverent. That cave was already there. She paused the video, staring at the frozen frame. Behind him, in the reflection of the observation window, there was a faint shape, tall, narrow, impossible to define, standing in the corner of the room. She blinked, and it was gone. For the first time in her career, Holt felt something she couldn't explain. The mountain had given her pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. One suspect missing, another dead lead, and a victim who remembered nothing except whispers in the dark. Yet the deeper she dug, the clearer one truth became: Ethan Cole hadn't stumbled into the wrong cave. Someone had guided him there, someone who knew the terrain, the history, and the hollow beneath the stone. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the distant, rhythmic sound of metal on rock. Holt turned off the video, but the sound stayed in her head long after. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't machinery. It was slower, deliberate, almost patient, the sound of something working, deep below the ground, waiting for her to listen. It was a hardware store, the kind that smelled like sawdust, oil, and rain-soaked rope, that gave the investigation its first real pulse. Holt had almost missed it. The lead came buried in a stack of interview transcripts from the initial canvas of Oak Ridge. One clerk, a man named Raymond Pike, had mentioned something odd during a follow-up with a junior deputy, a customer who had come in late one evening the week Ethan disappeared, paying cash for heavy-duty restraints. The deputy had written it off as coincidence. Holt didn't. She knew how easily truth hid in small, mundane details. The store sat at the edge of town, half a century old, its neon sign flickering through the mist like a tired heartbeat. Holt visited just after closing time, when the aisles were empty and the smell of iron hung thick in the air. Pike was in his 50s, stoop-shouldered, with grease on his hands and a nervous habit of rubbing his thumb over his knuckles when he talked. He recognized her immediately. "You re the sheriff working that cave case," he said. "Figured you'd show up eventually." He led her to the counter, where a logbook of cash transactions sat open beside a stack of invoices. "I still remember the guy," he said. "Came in right before we locked up. Quiet type, knew what he wanted, didn't browse, didn't ask for help." He listed off the items: 20 feet of industrial chain, 2 carabiners rated for heavy loads, a coil of nylon rope, a set of ratchet straps, and, strangely, a box of tranquilizer dots sold for animal control. All paid in cash. "He wasn't local?" Holt asked. Pike shook his head. "Not that I'd seen before, but he had that look, you know, like he'd been around these parts a long time. Like the kind of man who could walk into the woods and not need a map." The store's security camera covered only the register area, grainy and colorless. Holt watched the footage on Pike's old monitor, its screen smudged with fingerprints. The timestamp read 7:03 p.m., the night before Ethan disappeared. The man entered from the left, wearing a dark jacket, gloves, and a baseball cap pulled low. His face was mostly hidden, but his posture told its own story: erect, steady, with the efficient, almost mechanical precision of someone accustomed to physical work. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around. He gathered everything in a single trip, placed it on the counter, and waited. As Pike rang him up, the man glanced toward the store's front door, not once, but twice, as if checking to see whether anyone was coming. He signed the receipt with a name that wasn't legible. "When I asked if he needed help loading," Pike said, "he told me no," and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was empty, like he was thinking about something else. The man exited, carrying the supplies in 2 burlap sacks. The camera caught a partial glimpse of his vehicle through the glass door, an old Ford Bronco, khaki green, with mud streaks along the sides and a cracked taillight. It drove off without headlights. Holt paused the footage at the exact frame where the vehicle's rear was visible. She zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, revealing half a license plate. The numbers were smeared by dirt, but the first 3 characters were clear enough: 9 or 2. It was something. Back at the sheriff's office, Holt ran the partial plate through every database available, cross-referencing vehicle registrations across Oregon, Idaho, and Northern California. Hundreds of results, then dozens, then a handful. Only one caught her eye: a 1996 khaki Bronco registered to Doug Laird, age 47, former geological surveyor, last known address in Mackenzie Ridge, a small town 40 miles west. His occupation struck her immediately: a geologist, a man who knew the earth, a man who understood how stone could hide things. She pulled his file. Laird had worked for a mining consultancy that specialized in mapping underground structures, old shafts, and cave systems. He'd been laid off 3 years earlier when the company folded. the last recorded project he'd worked on, a survey of the very region surrounding the Cascades. Afterward, he'd purchased a small parcel of land in the foothills near an abandoned access road and had paid property taxes in cash ever since. There was no phone number listed, no relatives nearby, and no record of employment since. He had simply vanished from the grid. The more Holt read, the colder she felt. She remembered the clean precision of the chains, the mathematical alignment of the bolts in Black Hollow. Whoever had built the chamber hadn't guessed their placement, they'd calculated it. The symmetry matched geological safety patterns, the kind designed to distribute stress evenly through stone. Someone had engineered that cell. She showed the footage and vehicle data to her team. Reeve leaned back in his chair, whistling low. "You think this guy built the whole setup?" Holt nodded slowly. He didn't just build it. He designed it. He understood the rock better than anyone. She pointed to a map of the region. "If he knows the old mining routes, he knows how to move underground without being seen." They drove to Mackenzie Ridge at dawn. The town was barely more than a scattering of old buildings along a road that hadn't seen new asphalt in years. The address on record led them to the edge of the forest, where a dirt path wound through overgrown brush to a weathered cabin. The Bronco sat out front, its paint faded but unmistakable. No license plates. The windows were covered from inside with sheets of plywood. Holt motioned for her team to spread out. The place was silent except for the low hiss of the wind. When she knocked, the door creaked open under her hand. The air inside smelled of damp stone and something metallic, faint but familiar, the same odor that had lingered in Black Hollow. The living room was spare: a table, a cot, a kerosene lamp, and against the wall a shelf of notebooks and rolled maps. She picked one up. The pages were covered in hand-drawn diagrams of tunnels and rock formations, detailed, meticulous, labeled in tiny script. Several maps marked Black Hollow, others Red Valley Vent Shaft, and then one worded repeatedly in the margin: subject. Below it, lists of times, numbers, and physiological terms: isolation threshold, response latency, sensory deprivation period. Chen uncovered a small wooden crate beneath the cot. Inside were Polaroid photos. Most were landscapes, rock faces, tunnel entrances, shadows on stone. But a few weren't. They showed a man in different states of decline: thin, pale, chained, head bowed. Ethan. The dates written on the edges spanned months. The final one was taken less than 2 weeks before his rescue. The discovery chilled the room into silence. There was no sign of Laird himself, no clothing, no toothbrush, no food, not even dust where objects should be been. The cabin felt recently abandoned, like someone had known they were coming. Holt ordered the perimeter searched, but all they found were footprints leading into the woods, heavy, deliberate, ending abruptly near a slope that dropped into dense brush. The lab later confirmed the fingerprints on the photos matched those on the chains and bolts from the cave. The handwriting on the maps matched Laird's employment forms. Every line of evidence pointed to him, yet he was nowhere. Holt stood outside the cabin that night as the rain returned, staring into the tree line. Somewhere in that darkness was a man who had built an experiment in stone, a man who'd studied isolation not as punishment, but as data. The forest was utterly still, save for the faint murmur of wind moving through the pines. It almost sounded like breathing. Holt's flashlight swept across the trees, catching the reflection of metal, a fragment of chain hanging from a low branch, swaying slightly. She approached, heart pounding. It wasn't rusted, it was clean, polished, as though it had been placed there minutes ago. She called out his name once softly. The forest didn't answer. But somewhere far off, deep in the direction of the hollow well, she thought she heard something metallic echo through the rain, slow, rhythmic, like the sound of a man at work in the dark, hammering something into the heart of the mountain. The rain had barely stopped when Sheriff Dana Holt sat alone in her office, studying the photographs of the man now known as Douglas Laird. His driver's license image stared back at her from a decade ago, a face ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd, narrow features, dark eyes, short hair graying at the temples. He could have been a teacher, a park ranger, a mechanic. No one who saw that photo would imagine the cold, deliberate cruelty she'd seen in his work. The maps from his cabin were spread across her desk, curling at the corners, the ink smudged from her fingertips. Lines and numbers formed networks of tunnels, paths, and annotations that made her uneasy. Some of the symbols matched geological markings, others did not. She'd shown them to a mining engineer who'd worked in the Cascades for 20 years. He said quietly, whoever drew these didn't just map the mountain, he lived inside it. Every trace of Laird's life pointed toward a man who had systematically erased himself. No utility bills, no bank records, no social security activity in over 3 years. The property he lived on wasn't listed under his name, but under a holding company that didn't exist outside a post office box. His last recorded job had ended abruptly after an internal investigation into unsanctioned site exploration. When Holt pressed for details, the surviving members of the company's board refused to elaborate, only saying that Laird had been unstable and fixated on subterranean isolation modeling. One memo obtained quietly from a former colleague mentioned a phrase that lodged in Holt's mind like a thorn: human adaptation under geological confinement. If Laird had been fired for pursuing an unauthorized experiment, then the experiment hadn't died with his job. He'd simply taken it somewhere no one would look, deep beneath the Cascades, where silence was easy to mistake for emptiness. Holt imagined him hauling chains and tools through narrow tunnels, methodical and unhurried, designing his prison with the precision of an engineer and the devotion of a believer. The question that kept her awake wasn't how he'd done it. She understood the logistics now. What she couldn't shake was why. Her team continued to scour the forest around Mackenzie Ridge for signs of him. The footprints near the cabin were puzzling. They led into the trees but ended abruptly, not at a trail or road, but at a fissure, a long, narrow split in the ground where rainwater pooled in the dark. The geologists called it a subsidence crack, the kind that forms when the rock beneath shifts and sinks. Holt looked down into it and thought of all the tunnels on Laird's maps. He went underground, she said quietly. He's still down there. That same week, a series of small tremors rippled through the valley, not enough to damage buildings, but strong enough to be felt. Locals said they'd heard noises at night, like distant drilling or hammering. The forestry department chalked it up to seismic settling. Holt didn't believe that. When the rain cleared, she drove to the hollow well, the place where Ethan's scent had vanished a year before. The site was still taped off, warning signs half buried under moss. The air there was different, damp, metallic, and strangely charged, as if holding its breath. Standing on the ridge, she listened. At first, there was nothing but the wind, then faintly something deeper, a rhythmic pulse, too regular to be natural, like the echo of steel on stone. She returned to the cabin and examined the maps again. Near the bottom of one, a section was labeled V3, Access Route Red Valley Old Shaft 70. The handwriting was tight and precise, the same as the notes found in the cave. It matched one of the sealed mining shafts Chen had identified earlier, the one filled with concrete 2 months after Ethan vanished. Holt ordered the site reopened, despite the county engineer's protests about safety. The work crew began at dawn. They drilled through the concrete cap and unearthed a narrow tunnel descending almost vertically. The air that rose from it was cold and fetid, smelling of stone dust and something older, a scent like rust and decay. A camera drone was lowered first. Its feed showed walls reinforced with metal braces and tool marks fresh enough to gleam under the light. 50 feet down, the shaft opened into a chamber, and there, partially hidden under a tarp, lay a cot, a metal table, and rows of jars filled with murky liquid. When the footage streamed into Holt's tablet, her stomach turned. The jars weren't empty. Inside each one was a small object, bits of fabric, fingernail clippings, strands of hair, personal remnants, human samples. On the table lay a notebook sealed in plastic. The first page bore a title in careful print: Project Threshold Stage 2. The entries were meticulous: dates, observations, physiological notes. It read like a scientific study, but with an undercurrent of obsession. Subject displays resistance to prolonged isolation. Fear responses diminish after week 6. Speech patterns collapse entirely by week 10. Another line: auditory distortions reported. Subject claims to hear movement below. Will investigate. The last entry was dated only days before Ethan's rescue. Subject no longer responds. Replacement required. Holt's breath caught at that final line. Replacement, that meant Ethan wasn't his first victim. The realization struck her with the weight of something ancient and cruel. She'd spent months searching for a single missing man, never realizing the mountain had swallowed others long before. The lab confirmed the dye in one jar matched an unidentified male reported missing in 2015. A local drifter last seen near the Red Valley logging site. 2 other samples yielded no matches. The timeline fit too neatly: Laird's firing, his move into the mountains, the series of disappearances dismissed as hikers lost to weather or terrain. It was a pattern disguised by geography, hidden by wilderness. When Holt brought the findings to the district attorney, he asked if she was certain Laird was still alive. She said she wasn't sure, but that she felt him everywhere. His handwriting on maps, his fingerprints on metal, his voice echoed in the rhythms of the cave. He had built a world beneath theirs, one that followed its own rules of time and survival. That night, she drove out alone to the shaft where the jars had been found. The workers had left, leaving the opening fenced and covered. She stood at the edge, flashlight in hand, and peered into the dark. The beam cut down through the dust, illuminating nothing but black rock. Then faintly, she saw it a glint far below, like the reflection of an eye-catching light. Her heart slammed in her chest. She blinked, and it was gone. Rain began to fall, tapping softly against the metal railing. She stayed there until the flashlight started to fade. The mountain loomed around her, vast and indifferent, its silence thick and alive. Somewhere below, she knew tunnels still stretched outward, the ones on his maps that hadn't yet been found. She pictured him moving through them, the quiet scrape of his boots on stone, the echo of his tools. He wasn't running, he was working. When Holt finally turned back toward her car, she felt it, a vibration underfoot, faint but rhythmic. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. It could have been water, it could have been machinery, but deep down she knew it wasn't. It was a man marking his place in the dark, reminding her that he was still there, shaping the earth to his design. The sheriff didn't look back. She drove away in silence, but long after she'd left the valley, the sound followed her, the steady pulse of metal against stone, echoing from beneath the ground like a heart that refused to stop. The morning after they discovered the journals, the valley was wrapped in fog so thick it looked like the forest was drowning in smoke. Sheriff Dana Holt barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those jars, the milky liquid, the hair drifting like underwater weeds, the precise handwriting labeling each one. Project Threshold Age 2, the words refused to leave her. When she arrived at the station, her team was already waiting, faces pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. On the conference table lay a collection of photographs and evidence bags taken from the shaft. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Maya Chen, the forensic specialist, was the first to speak. "We finished processing the rest of the cabin," she said. "There's more." She opened a file and laid out several photographs. They showed sketches, rough pencil drawings on yellowed paper. Each one depicted a human figure, emaciated and bound, surrounded by strange geometric patterns. They weren't just sketches of bodies. They were diagrams, measurements marked along limbs, ratios written in Laird's small, tidy script. In one, the figure was drawn crouching, surrounded by circles representing light intensity. At the bottom, a single phrase was written: "The body adapts before the mind." Holt studied the drawings silently. He wasn't just experimenting, she said finally. He was studying transformation. Reeve leaned forward, pointing to one of the sketches. "We think those circles match the light fixtures in the cave. The pattern matches the layout from the photos, 6 bulbs around the chamber, symmetrical. He planned that space, every bolt, every inch." Maya nodded. "And the materials he used, the bolts, the chains, even the ceramic mug, all sourced from within a 50-mile radius. He knew what would last underground, what wouldn't corrode. He built that place to endure." Holt's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "Then he didn't plan for Ethan to die down there," she said quietly. "He planned for him to live." The room went still. The thought was unbearable, the idea that Ethan's survival wasn't mercy, but design. Later that afternoon, Holt and Maya returned to Black Hollow with a forensic team. The path down into the cave had been stabilized by metal supports and rope lines, but the descent was still treacherous. Cold air rose from the entrance, thick with moisture and the faint smell of rust. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, until even the sound of their breathing seemed too loud. The light from their helmets revealed the same narrow corridor where Ethan had been found. The walls glistened with moisture, the air heavy with the same metallic tang. Holt's beam swept across the chamber. The chains were gone, collected as evidence, but their shadows still lingered, etched into the rock by years of pressure and friction. In the far corner, beneath a ledge of stone, she saw something the first team had missed: a narrow passage leading deeper into the cave. It was no wider than her shoulders, hidden by the natural curvature of the wall. "Chen," she called, crouching low, "you see this?" Maya joined her, shining her light inside. The tunnel extended into blackness, smooth and unnaturally straight. "That's not natural formation," Maya said. "That's been cut." They squeezed through the opening, crawling on hands and knees until the passage opened into a smaller chamber. It was barely tall enough to stand in, but large enough to hold a workbench, a small generator, and a stack of empty fuel cans. Against one wall was another set of sketches, pinned to the stone with rusted nails. These were different, more intricate, more disturbing. A sequence of human faces, each one slightly altered from the last, eyes hollowing, mouths thinning, skin becoming almost translucent. In the final drawing, the face was little more than a skull, but the eyes were still alive. Holt felt her stomach turn. He lived down here, she whispered. He worked here. Maya ran her gloved fingers over the bench. No dust, she said. This hasn't been empty long. She picked up a small glass vial that lay near the edge. Inside was a clear fluid with faint sediment settled at the bottom. A handwritten label read Phase 2 compound. The handwriting matched Laird's. Bag it, Holt ordered. As they prepared to leave, Holt noticed a single word carved into the wall near the exit, a word gouged deep into the rock with something sharp. Listen. The letters were jagged, uneven, but deliberate. It wasn't the first time she'd seen that word. Ethan had said it, to or something close. He said, "Don't look up." Now it felt like part of a message, half finished. Don't look up. Listen. Outside, the air felt too bright, too alive. Holt climbed into her vehicle and sat for a long moment, staring at the mountains. They no longer looked beautiful, just ancient and watchful. That night, she brought the vial to the state crime lab. The chemical analysis revealed traces of sedatives mixed with mineral compounds, limestone dust, calcite, and something synthetic. A polymer used in geological sealants. It wasn't poison, it was preservation. The lab report suggested the formula could slow metabolic function, reduce the body's energy consumption without causing full unconsciousness. He was experimenting with keeping people alive longer, the chemist said, like putting a living body into hibernation. Holt felt the weight of that sink in. Ethan hadn't just been kept captive, he'd been controlled. Physically altered by an environment and chemicals designed to push the boundaries of human endurance. Laird hadn't built a torture chamber, he'd built a laboratory. The next day, Holt returned to the hospital to see Ethan. He was still fragile, still mostly silent, but something in his eyes had changed. They were clearer, more focused, as if pieces of memory had begun to drift back from wherever they'd been hiding. When she entered, he looked at her and whispered. He was trying to stay. Holt moved closer. Stay where, Ethan? He hesitated, eyes darting toward the window. Below, he said, there's another layer under the stone, a place where you can't hear the wind. His voice dropped lower. He said, the earth listens back. Those words clung to Holt long after she left. She replayed them over and over, thinking of the word carved into the wall, listen, and the tremors that still shook the valley. It felt less like a clue and more like a warning. That night, Holt dreamed of the tunnels. She saw them stretching endlessly beneath the mountain, not carved but grown, twisting like veins. In the dream, she heard the same slow rhythm she'd heard near the hollow well metal striking stone, and then another sound, softer, deeper, like breathing. When she woke, her phone was vibrating on the nightstand. The message was from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It showed the entrance of the shaft they'd sealed the week before. The safety fencing was gone, the tarp torn open. And in the corner of the image, barely visible but unmistakable, the reflection of a man standing in the darkness, holding a lantern that burned with cold white light. Holt's hands shook as she zoomed in. The face was shadowed, but the posture straight, deliberate, was the same as the man in the hardware store footage. Douglas Laird was alive, and worse, he was watching. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping through the valley like the slow exhale of the mountain. Holt stared at the screen until the photo disappeared, the number already disconnected. Somewhere beneath the ground, she knew the experiment hadn't ended. It had only moved deeper. The call came just before dawn. Holt had been sitting in her truck on the overlook above the valley, the engine off, her coffee cold. She hadn't slept since the message arrived, the photo of the shaft, the ghostly figure with the lantern. The number had vanished before her tech team could trace it, but the image burned into her mind. When the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, she already knew what it would be. "Sheriff, we got something near Red Valley," the voice said. "Construction crew found an opening, wasn't there yesterday. Looks like it goes straight down." Holt turned the key, the truck roaring to life. "Keep the site secured," she said, "and don't go near the edge." The sky was bruised purple when she arrived. The air smelled of wet soil and pine, heavy from overnight rain. The crew, 2 men from the forestry service, stood beside a gap in the ground, wide enough to swallow a truck. Firth rimmed the edges as if something below had pushed upward, splitting the surface open. Holt leaned over, flashlight in hand. The beam fell into an abyss of slick rock and glimmering moisture. The light disappeared before it reached the bottom. "How deep?" she asked. "Don't know," one of the men said. "Dropped a flare, never hit bottom." She crouched, running a hand along the lip of the opening. The soil was damp but compacted, the break too clean to be natural. Someone or something had cleared it from below. She felt the faintest vibration under her palm, steady and rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. She drew her hand back quickly. "Mark the perimeter," she said. "I want every entrance to this sector closed until I say otherwise." Back at the station, the rest of the team was already waiting. Maya Chen spread a new map across the table, a satellite overlay of the valley. "This fissure aligns with one of Laird's unmapped tunnels," she said. "If the depth readings are right, it connects directly to the chamber where we found the jars." Holt stared at the glowing lines on the map, arteries of light cutting through the mountain. "He's still expanding," she said quietly. "He's building something." Reeve frowned. "You think he's alive down there, after all this time?" Holt didn't answer. She was thinking of the photo, of that pale light in the dark. She thought of Ethan's voice, the whisper that had haunted her. He said, "The earth listens back." 2 days later, they sent in a drone equipped with sonar and a thermal camera. The live feed flickered onto the monitor as it descended wet stone walls, streaks of mineral, the narrow shaft twisting into blackness. The hum of the drone echoed strangely, as if the sound were bouncing off unseen chambers. At 300 feet, the sonar began picking up side passages. At 500, the temperature dropped sharply. "That's impossible," Maya said. "It's too deep for open air, but too warm for groundwater." Then, at 1612 feet, the camera caught movement, a flicker, small, indistinct, like something shifting just beyond the beam. The operator slowed the drone, adjusting focus. For a moment, the image cleared, a metallic glint, then the unmistakable shape of a human figure, standing motionless at the edge of the light. It was gone a second later. The feed cut to static. The crew pulled the drone up, but when it surfaced, its casing was scorched, and the thermal sensors were dead. Whatever had happened below hadn't been mechanical. "It's like the air cooked it," the operator said. Holt said nothing. She stared at the twisted metal in silence, her jaw tight. That night, she couldn't bring herself to go home. She stayed at the station long after the others left, reading through Laird's journals again. There were notes she'd overlooked before, faint pencil marks between the lines below the resonance point. The walls begin to respond. Patterns match low-frequency vibration. Listening frequencies alter perception. It was scientific and deranged in equal measure. Another note chilled her more than the rest. The subject's silence is necessary. The mountain speaks through him when the body fails. She closed the notebook, heart pounding. The idea that the mountain was speaking wasn't metaphorical to Laird. It was the core of his experiment. He wasn't testing survival, he was testing communication, something ancient beneath the rock, something he believed could be heard. The next morning, Holt drove to the hospital again. Ethan had been moved to a secure psychiatric unit, his condition fragile but stable. She signed in under an assumed name to avoid reporters. The nurse at the desk gave her a tired smile. "He's awake today," she said softly. "He's been humming same few notes over and over." When Holt entered the room, Ethan was sitting up in bed, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. His skin looked healthier, but his gaze was far away. The sound she heard was low and rhythmic, a tune made of 3 notes, rising and falling like breath. She sat down beside him. "Ethan," she said gently, "I need to ask you something." He turned toward her, expression unreadable. "Do you remember Douglas Laird?" she asked. The name seemed to ripple through him. He flinched, his hand tightening on the blanket. "He listens," Ethan whispered. "He listens to what's under us." Holt leaned closer. "What's under us, Ethan?" He hesitated, then looked directly into her eyes. "It's not rock," he said. "It's waiting." Before she could respond, his monitors spiked. He began to shake violently, gasping, eyes wide. Nurses rushed in, pulling Holt back as alarms filled the room. Ethan's heart rate soared, then plummeted. For a moment he looked past all of them, his lips moving silently. The doctor pressed a stethoscope to his chest. "He's gone into shock," she said. The monitors screamed, then went flat. They revived him after 2 agonizing minutes. When he came to, his first word was down. Then he began humming again, the same three-note pattern. Holt stood outside the room afterward, her reflection pale in the glass. She felt the hum still vibrating in her bones, the same rhythm she'd felt under her palm at the fissure. It wasn't random. It was the same cadence the drone had recorded deep underground. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. That night she drove back to Red Valley. The perimeter fencing had been torn again. Rain misted through the trees, whispering against her jacket. She approached the edge of the opening, flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The air rising from the fissure was warm now, carrying a faint metallic smell. Holt crouched low and listened. The sound was there, faint, deliberate, unbroken. Not machinery, not wind. A pattern, a message. She pulled out her phone, recording. The noise pulsed steadily, echoing through the rock, growing louder the longer she listened, as though responding to her heartbeat. Her chest tightened. Then, beneath the rhythm, another sound joined, softer, almost human, a voice. It was impossible yet unmistakable. "Sheriff Holt," it said. Her breath froze. The sound wasn't coming from the fissure anymore. It was behind her. She turned, flashlight shaking, but the beam caught only trees and fog. The voice came again, lower now, almost gentle. "You finally listened." She staggered back toward her truck, heart pounding, the recording still running in her hand. The last thing she saw before slamming the door shut was the faint glow of white light deep within the fissure, steady, unblinking, like a lantern waiting for her return. She drove through the storm without stopping, but even miles away the hum followed her. It wasn't in her ears anymore. It was in the ground itself, in the vibration of the tires, in the rhythm of her pulse. The mountain was awake, and whatever Laird had started, it was no longer his experiment to control. The sound stayed with her for days, a vibration beneath the surface of every quiet moment. Sheriff Dana Holt tried to tell herself it was stress, that her mind was replaying the low mechanical hum she'd heard in the fissure. But deep down she knew better. The rhythm wasn't in her imagination. It came and went like breathing, 3 pulses, a pause, 3 again, always faint, always steady, as if something deep below was alive and patient. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. When she did, she dreamed of the mountain, the stone shifting like muscle, tunnels twisting through veins of light. And somewhere in those dreams a voice kept whispering her name. By the end of the week, the fissure had widened. Satellite images showed the crack extending hundreds of feet in both directions, though no seismic activity had been recorded. The geologists couldn't explain it. "It's not tectonic," one of them told her. "It's deliberate. Something's displacing the soil from below." Holt drove out there with Maya Chen just before sunset. The sky hung low and bruised, the clouds bleeding red along the ridge. As they approached, the sound grew stronger, a dull resonance that made their teeth ache. Birds avoided the area now. The woods were silent except for the pulse. They parked at the edge, the headlights cutting across the mist. The opening was nearly twice the size it had been a week before. Steam rose from within, carrying the same metallic smell, copper oil, something faintly electric. Maya crouched, scanning the lip of the hole with her thermal camera. The screen flickered, then froze. "There's heat down there," she said. "A lot of it. It's not geological, it's pattern." Holt frowned. "Patterned how?" Maya adjusted the focus. "Like a circuit." That word lodged in Holt's mind as they climbed back into the truck. A circuit. She thought of Laird's notebooks, his maps, the symmetry of his chambers. What if the tunnels weren't just random? What if he'd carved them with intent, linking them in a grid that mimicked energy flow, a machine buried in stone, a mechanism that could breathe? That night Holt replayed the audio she'd recorded at the fissure. Through the background hiss of wind and static, she heard it again, the rhythm. But when she slowed the playback, something else emerged, faint layers beneath the pulses, like overlapping tones. When she filtered out the low frequencies, the pattern became clear. It wasn't random vibration. It was structured, almost melodic, a sequence of rising and falling notes repeating in cycles. It wasn't noise, it was signal. She called Maya immediately. "You need to hear this," she said. Maya arrived an hour later, hair damp from rain, laptop under her arm. They ran the recording through a spectral analyzer. The waveform appeared on screen, symmetrical, deliberate. Maya stared at it, lips parted. "This looks like modulation," she said, "like sonar or coded transmission." "From where?" Holt asked. "From below," Maya said quietly, "and it's getting stronger." The next day, they brought in a portable seismograph, setting it up near the fissure. Within minutes, the readings spiked. But what alarmed them wasn't the strength, it was the precision. The vibrations followed an exact rhythm, like a heartbeat measured by metronome. As the sun set, the ground began to tremble gently, not enough to topple the equipment, but enough to make their boots vibrate. Then faintly the same hum filled the air again. Holt felt it in her bones before she heard it, the mountain breathing, exhaling heat. "Something's alive down there," Maya whispered. "No," Holt said softly, "someone built something alive." They left before dark, but Holt couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she turned off the truck's headlights, she thought she saw a pale glow far behind them, flickering through the trees. When she got home, her house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. She poured whiskey into a glass and stared out the window. The night outside seemed thicker, heavier. She realized she could feel the vibration through the floorboards. It was faint, but they're the same 3 beats, the same pause. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Just one liner, "It listens better when you requiet." Her throat tightened. She stared at the message, the glass shaking slightly in her hand. Then, before she could reply, the phone buzzed again, this time with an audio file. When she played it, the hum filled the room, deeper and closer than before. But layered within it was something else, breathing, slow and human, followed by a whisper she couldn't decipher. Her pulse quickened. She turned off the phone, but the sound didn't stop. It was still there, faint but real, echoing from beneath the floor. The next morning, the town of Oak Ridge woke to reports of new sinkholes along the valley road. One swallowed a section of forest. Another opened beneath an old ranger outpost. Witnesses described hearing a low moan before the ground gave way. The geologist called it mass subsidence. Holt called it what it was, spreading. She and Maya returned to the site with a small rescue drone, determined to find the source of the heat signatures. The descent took minutes. At 200 feet, the drone's light reflected off something metallic. At 3, they saw walls reinforced with steel beams, new ones, not old mining supports. And at 400, they found a chamber unlike the one where Ethan had been found. This one was vast, circular, ribbed with arches of stone that gleamed like bone. In the center stood a structure, a tower of scaffolding, cables, and pulsing lights. The video feed trembled. Steam hissed from vents in the floor. Then, near the base of the structure, movement, a figure standing perfectly still, head bowed, wearing a miner's coat streaked with dust. Maya zoomed in. The face came into view for only a second before the feed cut to black, but it was enough. Douglas Laird was alive. The connection severed, the screen flickering with static. Maya swore under her breath. Holt stood frozen, her heart hammering. He hadn't fled. He hadn't been hiding. He'd been working, expanding his design, turning the mountain into something alive. That night she wrote her first unsent report. She didn't mention the photo, the messages, or the drone feed. Instead, she wrote a single line in her notebook: "The mountain is listening, and now it knows my name." She closed the book and sat in darkness, the hum faint but constant beneath her house, a low whisper rising through the earth. For a moment, she thought she heard another sound beneath it, tapping, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking from far below, counting the seconds between each breath. When she leaned closer to the window, she saw a thin line of white light glowing along the horizon where the valley met the ridge. It wasn't lightning. It was steady, unwavering, as though the mountain had finally opened its eyes. By the time the first snow fell over the Cascades, Oak Ridge was no longer the same town. The air had changed. People said the ground vibrated at night, that glasses rattled on shelves though no trucks passed by. Pets refused to go outside after dark, and deep cracks had begun appearing in roads and basement floors. The townsfolk blamed early frost or groundwater shifts, but Holt knew better. She'd seen the recordings. She'd heard the hum. The mountain wasn't sleeping anymore. The sheriff's office had become a war room, maps covering every surface, red markers tracing the expanding fissures through the valley. They spread like veins, each one connecting back toward a central point under Red Valley, the place where Douglas Laird had vanished. Maya Chen hadn't slept in 2 days, her hands trembling over the keyboard as she overlaid seismic readings onto Laird's old maps. The result chilled them both. The pattern formed a perfect spiral, each ring deeper than the last, descending into the earth like a slow, turning drill. Holt stared at the screen, jaw tight. "He's building something that moves," she said, "or something that grows." They'd lost the drone feed weeks ago, but the data had survived. The last frame showed the vast chamber beneath the mountain, the metallic tower rising from stone, the pulsing white lights. Maya enhanced the footage again, freezing it at a moment they hadn't noticed before. Between the beams of the structure, faint shapes were visible, suspended like cocoons. Human silhouettes, dozens of them. He's not just building, Maya whispered. He's populating it. Holt said nothing. Her mind replayed the image again and again, those motionless figures hanging in the glow. Victims, maybe, or something worse. The governor's office refused further excavation permits. The terrain is unstable, the memo said. We can't risk another collapse. It was bureaucratic code for fear. They wanted the story buried, the press silenced, the valley forgotten. But Holt couldn't forget. She'd seen too much. The memory of that voice near the fissure still echoed in her ears, low, deliberate, whispering her name. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wake to find the same rhythm vibrating through her walls. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. One evening, Maya burst into Holt's office, a laptop under her arm. You need to hear this, she said. The latest seismograph data showed pulses not just from below, but in a pattern that radiated outward through the ground in concentric waves. It's signaling, Maya said. The frequency's spreading. It's not random, it's coordinated. Coordinated with what? Holt asked. Maya hesitated. With us. She played back the waveform, and Holt felt the blood drain from her face. The pulse matched human brainwave intervals, specifically alpha frequencies associated with calm and suggestion. It's not just sound, Maya said. It's influence. For a long moment, Holt said nothing. Then she asked, what happens when it gets stronger? Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. 2 nights later, the valley lost power. Streetlights flickered and died. The hum grew so intense that the windows of Holt's truck vibrated when she parked outside the fissure site. The air shimmered faintly, heavy with static. In the distance, pale light pulsed through the fog, rhythmic and slow, as if the mountain itself were breathing. Holt gripped her flashlight, its beam trembling across the ground. She wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the mist, slow, deliberate, almost human. They weren't carrying tools or lanterns. They didn't need to. The light came from them, from beneath their skin, a faint glow pulsing in sync with the earth's rhythm. For a moment, she thought they were miners, survivors. But when the first one turned toward her, she froze. Its eyes reflected nothing. Its face was blank, the expression serene, like someone in deep sleep. The skin along its neck shimmered faintly, veins glowing the same cold white as the fissure. Douglas, she whispered, what have you done? The figures moved past her without acknowledgement, walking single file toward the valley. She counted at least a dozen before they vanished into the fog. Holt followed, staying low, keeping her distance. The trail led to a clearing near the old mining road where the ground had split wide open. The fissure glowed like molten glass, widening with every passing second. From within came the same hum she'd heard since the beginning, but now it was layered, hundreds of tones woven together like a choir. She raised her flashlight, and there he was, Douglas Laird, standing at the edge. His beard was longer, his eyes sunken, but his posture was unchanged. He looked at her calmly, almost kindly. You came, he said, his voice carried, easily amplified by the air itself. I knew you would. What did you do? Holt shouted over the sound. What is this? Laird smiled faintly. Evolution, he said. The mountain isn't stone, Sheriff. It's memory. It listens and it learns. I gave it a voice. He spread his arms wide, the light from the fissure reflecting off his hands. It needed someone to speak for it. Now it has many. You killed those people, Holt said, her voice trembling. You used them. I freed them, he replied. They're not gone. They're part of the network now. The mountain remembers them. It remembers everything. He took a step closer to the edge, and soon it will remember you too. Before she could react, the ground trembled violently. Cracks snaked outward from the fissure, the earth splitting beneath her boots. She stumbled backward as the light flared, blinding and pure. A sound like 1,000 heartbeats filled the air. Then, as suddenly as it began, the tremor stopped. When Holt opened her eyes, the fissure was gone. The clearing was silent, the fog heavy and unmoving. Laird had vanished, along with the glowing figures. Only a faint warmth lingered under the soil. Maya and the rescue team found her an hour later, standing motionless in the dark. Over the next week, the town tried to return to normal, but the rhythm never left. The hum was gone from the air, yet people complained of hearing it in their sleep, soft, distant, like the earth murmuring. A few went missing, hikers mostly, drawn toward the mountains. Their tracks led to the tree line, then disappeared. Holt filed her final report by hand. Most of it was factual dates, witness statements, geological readings. But at the end, she wrote something she didn't include in the official record. The mountain is not finished. It's awake now. It remembers us all. That night, she packed a bag and drove north, away from Oak Ridge. She didn't look back. But as dawn broke over the ridges, she felt the vibration again, faint, familiar, pulsing through the steering wheel. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. It followed her like a heartbeat, steady and patient. She turned on the radio to drown it out, but every station played the same low-frequency hum beneath the static. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, beneath the road, beneath her tires, beneath the world itself. For the first time, Holt understood what Laird had meant. The mountain wasn't a place. It was a process, an awakening spreading through the bones of the earth, through the silence between frequencies, through the people who listened too closely. And as she drove deeper into the empty dawn, the rhythm quickened, matching the beat of her heart, until she couldn't tell which one belonged to her anymore. The story of Ethan Cole, Douglas Laird. And Sheriff Dana Holt is not merely about mystery or horror, it's a meditation on the fragile boundary between discovery and obsession, on how the human hunger to understand the unknown can become the very force that unravels us. At its core, it asks one uncomfortably timeless question: how far are we willing to go to control what we don't understand? And what happens when the thing we try to control begins to understand us? Douglas Laird began as a man of science, a geologist searching for meaning in the silence of the earth. His intention was not evil at first. He sought patterns, truth, a form of dialogue between humanity and nature that had never been spoken aloud. But like all tragedies born from curiosity, his search turned inward, consuming itself. In his desire to listen to the mountain, he stopped listening to anything else: morality, empathy, consequence. The story teaches us that obsession, when isolated from compassion, transforms knowledge into hunger. Laird's brilliance became his blindness. His logic, prison, what he mistook for understanding, was merely the echo of his own madness reflected back through stone. Ethan Cole, the man who vanished and was found chained beneath the mountain, became the embodiment of what happens when innocence collides with another's obsession. His disappearance was not random, it was the inevitable byproduct of someone else's search for power disguised as enlightenment. His captivity symbolizes the countless ways people become victims of systems, ideologies, and individuals who believe they are serving a greater purpose. Ethan's silence, his fractured mind, and his haunting whispers remind us that not all prisons are built of metal and stone. Some are carved from the fear and memory that others leave behind. He returned alive, but his life had been taken long before his rescue. Then there is Sheriff Holt, the reluctant witness. She represents reason standing on the edge of chaos, the fragile belief that truth can still be found in a world built on deception. Her persistence is both her virtue and her curse. She followed evidence with the discipline of a law officer, but also with the heart of someone desperate to impose order on a world slipping into myth. Her journey into the caves, her confrontation with Laird, and her final realization that the mountain remembers reveal the cruel paradox of human understanding. The more we uncover, the less we truly know. Holt's descent into the Valley of Echoes mirrors every investigator, every scientist, every dreamer who has ever chased the unknown only to realize that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The mountain itself becomes a metaphor for the collective unconscious, the vast, unyielding depth of history, memory, and nature's silent intelligence. It listens, as the story reminds us. It absorbs the vibrations of every step, every scream, every heartbeat that touches its surface. The mountain is not evil, it is indifferent. It reflects what we bring into it. When Laird spoke of giving it a voice, what he truly did was give shape to his own darkness. He fed the earth his obsession, and it echoed it back, amplified. In the end, the awakening of the mountain is not supernatural, it's psychological. It is the moment nature mirrors humanity's endless pattern of consumption, manipulation, and control. This story also holds a subtler warning about technology and ambition, the way we build systems, machines, or experiments without questioning the consequences of what they awaken. Laird's tunnels and circuits resemble the networks humanity has built: above-ground data grids, cities, systems of communication that hum beneath the surface of daily life. We too dig deeper into the fabric of the world, seeking connection, only to find ourselves entangled in what we've recreated. The mountain's hum, that rhythmic pulse spreading across frequencies, becomes a haunting symbol of how our creations begin to speak back to us, not in words but in influence. In noise that seeps into our sleep and thought until we no longer know where human will ends and the machine or the world begins. At a deeper level, the story explores the arrogance of human separation from nature. For centuries, we've treated the earth as an object, something to mine, to study, to conquer. Laird's Project Threshold is just an extension of that impulse. The belief that we can pierce into the heart of the world and still remain masters of it. But the story suggests a reversal. The earth is not passive, not mute. It listens, it remembers, it adapts. When Holt hears the mountain calling her name, when she feels its pulse in her own heartbeat, it's the story's quiet revelation. The price of intrusion is assimilation. When you go deep enough into something vast, it doesn't just reveal itself to you, it absorbs you into its truth. In the end, what remains of these characters are echoes. Ethan's fragmented memory, Laird's unholy experiment, Holt's final drive into the dawn, all leave behind vibrations in the soil of the story. Just as every human act leaves a trace upon the world. The mountain endures, patient and ancient, its hum carrying their names like a prayer or a warning. The final lesson is not about fear, but about humility. The unknown is not ours to own or command. Knowledge without conscience becomes desecration. Discovery without restraint becomes destruction. Perhaps the true horror is not that something beneath the mountain woke up, but that it always was awake, waiting for us to notice. It reflects a truth that modern life often forgets. Nature doesn't need to rage to destroy. It only needs to listen long enough for us to lose the rhythm of our own humanity. Holt's realization that she can no longer distinguish her heartbeat from the mountains becomes the story's last, tragic confession. The more we try to master the world, the more it shapes itself in our image, until the line between creator and creation disappears entirely. The lesson buried in this tale is both ancient and urgent. Curiosity is sacred, but without empathy it becomes a weapon. Progress is powerful, but without reverence it becomes ruin. The world beneath us, within us, and beyond us is not an empty void waiting to be mapped. It is a living system, vast and unmeasurable, that responds to how we treat it. The hum that Holt hears at the end is the sound of consequence, the echo of everything humanity has forgotten to respect. It is the voice of the earth reminding us that silence is not absence, and that listening is never without cost. And perhaps that is the final truth of Vanished in the Cascades, that the monsters we fear in the dark are not born of myth but of reflection. The deeper we dig into the world, the more we uncover ourselves, our greed, our pride, our desperate need to matter. The mountain only gave back what we buried in it, that the proof that, in our hunger to be gods of the earth, we have merely become its echo. The darkness doesn't end here. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me take you deeper into things not everyone dares to face.